Let's open our Bibles tonight to 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15. Begin reading with verse 23. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over, and let me start again. And all the country wept with a loud voice, and all the people passed over. The king also himself passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And Zadok also and all the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God, and they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. And the king said unto Zadok, Carry back the ark of God into the city. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again and show me both it and his habitation, or the temple. But if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, behold, here am I. Let him, God, do to me as seemeth good unto him. The king said also unto Zadok the priest, Art not thou a seer? Return unto the city in peace, and your two sons with you, Ahimaaz thy son, and Jonathan the son of Abiathar. See, I will tarry in the plain of the wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. Zadok therefore and Abiathar carried the ark of God again to Jerusalem, and they tarried there. In looking at Zadok, he's not the best known of Bible characters, but there are many different ways that we could look at him. There's many different directions that we could go in looking at this man. There are several things that we could spend a whole message on, just on a couple of single incidents that he was involved in. Tonight, I don't want to go into every avenue. I want to keep it as short as possible. I want to look at him. Who was he? Why is he in the Bible? What did he do that made him so important? And then I want to look at him and the value of true friendship. And I'll show you what kind of friend he was and what he was willing to do for David, his friend. First of all, who was Zadok? 2 Samuel chapter 8 says that he was a priest. So we know that being a priest, he was of the tribe of Levi, and part of his job was to receive the offerings from the people, to offer the offerings, and his particular tribe was responsible for moving the ark when it became necessary to move. David forgot that. We looked at Uriah and how that Uriah, put it on a cart, and the ox shook the cart, and the ark was about to shake and fall, and Uzzah grabbed it, and God killed him instantly. It was a great responsibility to be in charge of carrying the ark. and making sure that everything was just right. But he was also one of David's closest friends and advisors. Zadok had unlimited presence before the king's face. Now, can you imagine me going to D.C., going to the White House, and just walking up and saying, "I'm here to see the president"? How far do you think I would get? I wouldn't make it past the front door. Zadok could walk right in, go into the presence of the king anytime he wanted, anytime he needed. He had full and complete access to the king himself. We find out that he was a very dear friend of David. We'll look at some of that later. He was also one of David's top advisors. Now, our president has what's called a cabinet. In that cabinet, he's got, I don't know how many it's up to now, but there is the Secretary of Defense. There's the Secretary of Agriculture. There is the Secretary of State. There is the Secretary of Education and a whole lot more that the president meets with on a regular basis to get information, to get input, and help him make some policy decisions. Zadok was one of those type of men. When David needed advice, there were three men that he called. Zadok, who we are looking at. In fact, the Bible said that Zadok had the Spirit of God upon him. He was that good of a counselor that he had the Spirit of God upon him. Another man was named Ahithophel, who was also one of David's counselors, a close advisor. Ahithophel and Zadok were two of David's closest friends and closest counselors. In fact, 2 Samuel says that the counsel of Ahithophel was if God himself had spoken. David wanted only the best. He wanted only men that he could count on, that he could allow and trust enough to let them into his innermost circle. The third man is named Hushai. He was also another well-trusted friend and counselor. By the way, it was Hushai who was able to convince Absalom not to go after his dad immediately and to give David time to regather his forces and prepare to fight. But what did Zadok do? You know, I went over this many times in my mind. David was the greatest king that ever lived, ever. Every king after David was judged either, and you can read this in your Bible, they were either a good king like unto David, or they were not a good king like David. David became the gold standard for every other king that followed him. But David committed an atrocious sin. He committed adultery with Bathsheba. Then he had her husband Uriah killed in battle. And because of that sin, God said through Nathan the prophet, the sword shall never depart from your house. And so what is about to happen is a direct result of David's sin. I hear people occasionally say, well, I've gotten by with it for years. Doesn't mean you've gotten by with it. It just means God is patient and God is long-suffering. But David's sin was so terrible that God said the sword will never depart from your house. And so as a result of that, there are a number of things that happen, but one of them is Absalom begins to decide, I want to be king. I want to take over my father's throne. I want to kick my dad off of the throne and seat myself on my father's throne. I'm not preaching on Absalom per se, but he was very, very patient in winning the nation of Israel over on his side. It took him years, literally years, to get enough people on his side that he could lead an all-out rebellion against his dad. I've had several Absaloms in various churches that I've pastored, and I still get a little nervous when I see an individual suddenly getting other individuals aside and saying, do you agree with Brother Ellis? Well, no. Well, I think we need to do something about it. I've had that happen in several different churches, and even though, we've got wonderful fellowship and peace here, I have a hard time forgetting Absalom in several of the churches that I've pastored. He was willing to wait years if necessary. But then one day, he had enough people on his side that he openly led a rebellion against his father. He succeeded in driving David out of Jerusalem, and that's where we find our text. David has been forced to flee Jerusalem, go out into the wilderness, and literally run for his life. As we read in this chapter, some of his most dedicated army stayed with him. He had some friends that stayed with him. They followed him out of Jerusalem. Several of his generals and their armies stayed with him, but he was still forced to flee because of Absalom. As David is fleeing, Zadok, who was a priest, who was responsible for making sure if the ark was moved, that it was done in the right way, Zadok and his son along with another priest who served with him, they decided to take the ark and to follow David carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we don't think much about that, but that was a big, big, big deal for Zadok to do. Maybe he did it because he did not want Absalom to get a hold of it and defile it. Maybe he wanted David to still be able to worship God even though he did not have access to the temple. With the ark, David could still worship God. Maybe he felt that the visible presence of God should be with the rightful king. But whatever he was thinking, he and the other priests and their sons carried a very heavy, heavy ark a long distance to reach David. David sees him in the verses that we read and said, "What are you doing here? And why did you bring the ark with you?" "Because I wanted to be with my king. And I wanted the visible presence of God to be with my king." David, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, David said, "Hey, listen, the ark belongs in the temple. The ark does not belong out in the wilderness running from Absalom. The ark belongs in the temple. Take it back. Put it back where it belongs." Instead of letting the ark go with him, David said, "My prayer is that God will someday bring me back to Jerusalem, back to the temple, back to the ark, so that I can worship God there." But I find David's attitude here, talking to one of his best friends. He said, "The ark belongs in Jerusalem. Take it back. My prayer is that God will bring me back." But in verse 26, David said, "If I have no delight in God, behold, here am I. Let him do to me as seemeth good unto him." David is giving us the thoughts of his heart. He opened up to Zadok and said, "You know, what happens to me really is not important. If God delights in me, he will bring me back to Jerusalem. But if God does not delight in me because of my sin that brought about this whole scenario, then so be it." He felt he could open up and say, "Honestly, I'm not important, Zadok. I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate what you've done. But ultimately, my future, my life, my death is in God's hands, and I will accept whatever he says." And so Zadok did as David had requested. Takes the ark back, puts it back in the temple where it belonged, and then he waited for a message. What is Absalom going to do? Ahithophel had stood with David rock solid for most of David's kingdom. But somehow Absalom was able to convince Ahithophel to turn against David. And Ahithophel did a 180. He completely turned against David and became Absalom's advisor. Hushai, Zadok is in hiding because if he gets caught, he could be killed for any number of things. If he got caught carrying the ark out of Jerusalem and bringing it back, Absalom could have him killed. If he was caught sending messages to David of what was going on, Absalom could have him killed. So he literally put his life on the line, knowing that if he got caught, Absalom would most certainly kill him. So he goes back to Jerusalem and he waits for Hushai, who was still David's good friend. Ahithophel gave advice to Absalom, which had they followed Ahithophel's advice, David would most surely have been killed. But Hushai convinced Absalom not to follow Ahithophel's advice and instead follow his advice, which ended up being the reason David was able to win back the throne. So Hushai finds out what Ahithophel's advice was. And he gave what his advice was. Then he sent messengers to Zadok and said, "You've got to get word to David. Here's Ahithophel's advice. Here's my advice. You need to get word to David so he can be prepared." And so Zadok sent his son, along with the son of the other priest, to give David a heads up what's going on. Corresponding with the enemy could certainly have got all four of them killed. But Zadok was willing to risk his life and the life of his son in order to help David. Because Hushai convinced Absalom to not follow Ahithophel's advice, Zadok sent David the message and said, "These are the two suggestions, recommendations," and it gave David needed time to gather his generals, to gather his armies, to regroup, to reorganize, and prepare to fight. And that simple decision by Zadok to risk his life became the very means whereby when Absalom did attack, David was waiting, David was ready, and David's army defeated Absalom's army without any problem. Because Zadok was willing to risk his life along with the life of his son. Which brings me to my final point. Zadok was David's friend. Removing the ark put his life at risk. But in his mind, he thought the ark needed to be with the king. He was willing to risk everything because of his love for his king. Returning back to Jerusalem with the ark would definitely result in death if Absalom caught him. Sending his son to tell David, the two plans was so risky that Absalom sent a small army to capture Zadok's son and the other priestess' son, to kill them so that they could not get their message to David. Zadok was willing to risk everything for his friend who was in trouble. As I thought of that, a lot of scriptures came to mind, but I narrowed it down to 3 verses of scripture. Jesus said in John chapter 15 and verse 13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Certainly we know Jesus was talking about himself, his willing to die because of his love for his disciples and his friends, but it also is true in every other aspect. How much do you love your friends? Assuming you have some. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Zadok was willing to do that. He was willing to suffer death if he was caught because of his love for David. Proverbs 18:24. A man that hath friends must show himself friendly. Now I'm going to pause right there. Over the years, I've heard people say, "I just don't have any friends." Well, a man that hath friends must show himself friendly. I'm going to pick on you because you're there. Every time I talk to her, I insult her. Every time I see her, I make fun of her. Every time I'm around her, I put her down and do everything I can to put you down as low as I can. And then it's like, I don't know why she doesn't like me. Sometimes you have to show yourself friendly. If you want friends, be friendly, but that's not the main part of that verse. There is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Do you have a friend that you would stick closer than their own family? Do you have a friend that you would do anything, no matter what they're going through, you would stick by them through thick and thin, through mountains and valleys, through trials and hardships. There is a friend that sticketh closer than your own family. And then Proverbs. And you're going to think, how does that fit in? Give me just a second. Proverbs 27. Iron sharpeneth iron, so a man sharpeneth the countenance of his friend. A true friend sometimes has to, I should have thought of a word and wrote it down. Sometimes a true friend has to create friction because they are your friend. I've had some friends over the years that it's like, you know that's wrong. They loved me enough that they were willing to create friction. Iron sharpeneth iron, but not without friction. And so a man sharpeneth with friction sometimes the countenance of his friend. I'm thankful that I've had a few friends that were willing to call me out. I guess the closest one that I've ever had in my whole life had to be Brother Jerry Asbury. I've got a lot of friends, but nobody has ever done like he did. If he thought I was wrong, he would say, Brother Wilbert, he always called me Brother Wilbert. Brother Wilbert, you should not do that, or that's wrong. He loved me enough that he was willing to jeopardize our friendship. He loved me enough that he was willing to create some heat and some friction. The other one, both of my really good friends died. So I don't ever become my good friend, because you'll probably die if you do. Brother Harold Harvey, you've heard me talk of him. He was the man who could say, and do it in love, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Or, you need to think about that again. And those two men saved me from doing some terrible mistakes. They loved me enough that they were willing to create a little friction and some heat. If I don't care about you and I see you fixing to jump off of a cliff and kill yourself, I don't like you, I really don't care about you, I'm not going to risk my life to save you. But if I really love someone, I'm going to do everything in my power to keep them from making a mistake. What kind of friend are you? Jesus gave the story of a lady who had a friend come to visit her in the middle of the night and hadn't eaten, and she needed some bread. And so she went to a judge to get some bread. And my point isn't the judge. My point is she was willing to get up in the middle of the night and go out and try to find bread to feed her friend that had come to visit her. How far would you go to help a friend in need? Are you one of those fair-weathered friends that's a friend as long as you don't ask me to do anything? David was slandered by Absalom. Zadok stood up and defended him. Would you be willing to risk the anger of someone else to defend a friend? Several years ago, I had a man that I really, truly thought was a friend. I really did. And all of it, over a period of time, rumors began spreading about him to the point that almost everybody believed it. And they said, "Do you know what he's doing?" It's like, I don't believe it. He's my friend. I will not listen to it, until finally I was hit with such overwhelming evidence that I finally had to say, he is guilty. But I defended him against anybody and everybody until a total preponderance of evidence forced me to admit that he was guilty of several major things. Then he threatened my life. What kind of friend was he? Would your friendship stand the test of times? When your friend is going through ups and downs, trials and tribulations, would you be a friend like Zadok and say, I will do whatever I have to. I will go wherever I need to. I will stand with David, whether he's fleeing from Absalom or whether he is sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. I will stand with David. And I just realized your name is David. I'm not talking about you, hopefully. I will stand with them if it cost me my life. I will defend them to the very end. I will stand with them to the very end. Eventually, David was able to retake Jerusalem. Absalom was killed. And Zadok once again enjoyed the privilege of having access to the king sitting on his throne. But he proved his friendship long before that. Father, we come